go ahead and get started with that. All right. So again, my name is May Petrin. I'm part of the organic farm team. I work with Dakota's Best as well as coordinate our Transition Toolkits program, where I work with producers who are in the process of transitioning to organic. We also offer some marketing services, agronomy expertise. We collaborate with an organic crop insurance specialist, as well as offer plenty of options for organic seed. Just a little bit about me. I won't spend too much time here since some of you have met me or heard from me before, but just a little bit about my context. I came to Dakota's Best after being an organic inspector for a couple very busy years of putting on lots and lots and lots of miles. So I come at this topic from the perspective of having seen thousands of acres of organic cropland throughout the upper Midwest and beyond. So just my perspective there, I am not a crop farmer. I run a little sheep operation, and that's me. Just a little sampling of, as Johnny Cash would say, I've been everywhere, man. And today I just wanted to kind of focus up the conversation before I turn it over to Doug. So folks who are organic or thinking about it, this is just a sampling of the organic standard, kind of word for word. And I wanted to bring this up just because, you know, everybody in the organic community has heard the criticism that there's too much tillage. And that's bad. And we want to just kind of address that head on today and try to learn from each other. But as far as, you know, what's the regulation and the intention of the organic rule, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of it. That, you know, any kind of field management, whether it be tillage or other kinds of inputs, has to contribute to fertility, has to maintain or improve the soil system. So Doug, I will stop sharing my screen. I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of go wild.
Sounds good.
Let you out to pasture.
Out to pasture. I like that view. That's a great view. Great. I'm going to work on.
Should I go ahead and start that poll?
Sure, good.
All right. So we do have a couple producers on the call with us today, and this poll is for you. We just want to learn a little bit more about where folks are at in terms of tillage. So I'm going to launch this poll. And then I will see your responses to this question. If you work closely with an organic grower or multiple organic growers, you know, you can answer on behalf of them if that makes sense. So have you been able to reduce tillage in the last 3 years? So if you're not seeing this pop up on your screen, maybe kind of reduce your main window for Zoom and you might see the poll pop up. And as I mentioned in the questions, if none of them apply to you, you know, please share that in the chat box and I will kind of monitor that. And the question there at the bottom, purchasing or modifying equipment to deal with high residue or excess residue, was supposed to be that question. It got cut off there. So this will just help us get a little bit of an idea of where folks are at. Give it just a couple more seconds here. So far we just have adding crops to the rotation and lengthening the rotation. Couple folks chose that, and then purchasing or modifying equipment to deal with high residue. And then we have an other. So I'll leave that up and if folks find that, or if it's relevant, please go ahead and do that. Doug, I'll let you take it away.
Well, it sounds good. So if we're, as we get along here, everybody, I just want to encourage you to feel free to plug a question or a comment into the chat to make sure that we're addressing what you have on your mind today to make it pertinent. Because there is limited time today, we want to make sure that we touch your interests and address things that you've got on your plate. So yeah, so like May said, my name is Doug Voss. I am a independent consultant for Sustainable Farming Association. I've been with them for about 2 years now. And, where the focus as Sustainable Farming Association is farmer-to-farmer mentoring. If you haven't checked them out, I'd encourage you to. We have a lot of different things going on. And the good networking, I think that's really can be really profitable for farmers, talking with other farmers as they're, enduring challenges and appreciating successes. And the other plug I'd like to put out that I don't have a slide for would also be the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition. Another great platform for farmers to help farmers and talk with farmers about what they've got going on and how they can help each other. There's one thing I think that nearly everybody that I've talked to on the topic is that when you start talking with people that are focused on organic production or regenerative practices, is that there's just the willingness and openness to share ideas and different situations that really help each other. So I'd encourage you guys to check out those if you're looking for someone to bounce some ideas off of and such. A little bit about myself. I said I do farm, so I guess I kind of look at myself as a farmer, a father, and a consultant, kind of in that order. Not to say that family is less than that, but just kind of how we address our time throughout the day. My farm is by Paynesville. We historically had been a dairy farm until within the last about 20 years. We're the third generation on the farm. We did certify organic in '99 and are still currently. We've not only with the livestock, with the dairy, we've also got grass-fed beef, small heritage beef or sheep flock, and we do a significant amount of custom grazing these days of organic dairy replacement heifers. And so currently our farm is all in perennials, and we are grazing the entirety within the exception of 10 acres that we did make a few bales off of last year. But here's a look at my farm. So I do have experience in not only livestock, but then row crop organic production. We've done some specialty crops in the past, such as pinto beans and some flax and other cereals. We first started out in organic production, supplying some feedstuffs for organic dairy farms in our area that were expanding rapidly in the 90s and needed more feed for their livestock than they could generate on their own farms. That's somewhat since changed, but so yes, today everything is in perennials. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about our topic today about reducing tillage and different ways to approach that. So with that, we'll get started here. One thing I always like to talk about when I'm talking with farmers is the context in which they are approaching things, just like May had mentioned a little bit ago about her context and where she's coming from, because that's going to really steer a lot of concepts and mindsets as we go forward. But I also want you to think about how those kind of relate to the soil health principles in general. And, we can go through those. I know you had a conversation about that a couple weeks back. I'm not going to get into all the principles there just because of time limitations, but we're looking at that disturbance of tillage as we're moving forward. So defining my context, and some of the things that I think are interesting to think about is, some people think, that doesn't fit my context. Well, one thing I want you to consider is some things that maybe need to be changed or could be changed, and some things that just can't be changed in your operation. So some of those things can really shape as far as mindsets go, as far as what you can do, what you can't do, and in some cases, what people won't do. This one I love to throw the limiting factor one in there, because a lot of times people think of infrastructure or maybe a soil test as a limiting factor or bottlenecks, but I'd like to offer something else. And this is maybe going to be out of the box, and I always like to think out of the box. In fact, I like to encourage farmers to burn the box. But my limiting factor is the image I see when I think of my limiting factor is whenever I look in the mirror in the bathroom or whatever there, because I am the limiting factor on my farm. I am the manager, I am the farmer, I'm the owner, and you know, nothing much comes through my way on the farm except by me. And so if something doesn't happen or something does happen, it really does come back to myself. And yeah, humility is an important part of that. But just sometimes consider that when we're always trying to make excuses, maybe where if a crop didn't turn out the way we thought we wanted to, or whatever the case was. I'll give you a quick example. On our dairy farm, we had tremendous issues years back with herd health for a while, and we tracked it back to our water source. We had very high sulfate levels in our water. For example, I think you're only supposed to be allowed 250,000 parts per million for human consumption and 550,000 at the time for livestock consumption. Well, our numbers were 1,750 some. And so the reason I want to tell you that the issue was not the water, but management was it took me 3 samples to get tested in order for me to have proper information on my sample. Because see, the problem with taking a water sample and having it tested for sulfates, if you don't test it immediately from the time that you open your sample, you won't get proper results. So it took my management 3 attempts at our water lab to get an accurate test. So I guess I'd like you to think that the problem necessarily wasn't the water. Yeah, it was part of the issue, but the problem was that I needed to catch the issue and I needed to address it appropriately with my management. So from that perspective, I'm telling you that I consider myself my limiting factor on my operation. The other thing is that sometimes we think we're looking for answers or recipes, and regenerative ag, organic agriculture, it's not a destination, but it's a journey. And the best part about this is when we make good, successful decision making on our farm, we can build upon that from one year to the next. We're not looking at it from a chemical standpoint and a soil profile that we're starting from, you know, from zero or a percentage less than we did last year when we're moving forward. And the only constant in life is change. So we need to be able to adapt as we go forward with that. So today we're talking about disturbance. So don't just think tillage when we think disturbance, but I want you to think about all kinds of disturbances, chemical and physical. And that in nature, there isn't any mechanical or chemical disturbance. So nature's got a pretty darn good gig going for it. It can self-regulate, self-heal, and self-regulate if we don't get in the way. So I always want to encourage people to be looking at natural systems in order to figure out how we can fit into our context within that system. So with that, what are we going to model it after? You know, we're always looking at something to compare our operation and our management against, and we have to kind of decide where we're going to go to for the answers that we're looking for some of the questions that we have. And I always like to talk about this, and May and I have talked about this a bit in the past, but you know, so nature's not concerned about what we feel our context needs to be. You know, nature's rules have been established, and how we can work ourselves into that is going to make life much easier for us long run. You know, I had a producer one time talk, you know, there was a discussion about grazing, and he said, but I'm from row crop country. You know, we grow corn and beans here. And that's great. You know, here is where is here, because today corn and soybean production, you know, jeepers, you know, we're all the way from the Canadian border south to the Canadian border to the Mexican border. So that's a pretty big range. So, you know, sometimes my response to that is, well, where's the sign? You know, that's what we do here. That's our context. Well, again, is that a context that we've made for ourselves, or is that something that we think that we fall into? Just something to consider. And so I encourage people to find ways to work with the soil health principles, with the rules that are established that really aren't well, they're not debatable. And so some of the data, of course, is going to show that with some organizations, with tillage for sure. I like to throw this image out there because this is something that has received a lot of attention. And this is oftentimes a really great way to approach first steps if you're especially an organic producer or you're looking to be transitioning to organic production. But the introduction of cereal rye. Cereal rye has a really good ability to germinate in really cold temperatures. So oftentimes it's the last thing that we can plant in the fall. It's going to serve a few different things for us. One, I love the fact that it's incorporating a living root and extend our growing season much longer than we would be in a typical row crop scenario. It provides diversity that we don't have. You know, diversity is something that, again, within your context. So if you think, you know, maybe 2 or 3 crops in rotation is diverse, you know, that's very different from somebody's perspective in a native prairie situation, maybe a grazer that is looking at 100 to 200 plant species in the same area as being diverse. So when we're thinking of how we're going to compare our operation, you know, are we going to compare it against a natural system, or are we going to compare it against maybe an industry standard or contextual situation with the industry itself? And so this cereal rye was planted in the fall previous to this picture. And this is the farmer planting soybeans into that standing rye. And so what changes maybe could you consider now when we're talking about the topic of disturbance? Well, that would be the fact that we didn't do any heavy tillage, or in fact any tillage the fall before, except for with the whatever disturbance that this drill had done, because this drill planted the same rye last fall as it's planting the soybeans now. So there was limited disturbance in the fall. There was limited disturbance in the spring because we didn't do any spring tillage pass. And we went right into that living root environment, which, so I like to, okay, so when we're talking about tapping into natural systems compared to maybe what we're traditionally used to in a row crop setting, again, because that's my comparative right now, is that, you know, when we're trying to work with natural systems and using biology to cycle our nutrients and maintain that environment in which we want to grow the crops that we're looking to grow, then, you know, if we don't have a living root in that soil, it's like asking you and me to stop breathing. It's just that crucial and critical to the process.
Doug, I'm not gonna lie. The first time I saw this picture, I was like, where's the crimper? Is it on the front? Where is it?
Yeah, I love that. So, and I'm glad you brought that up too, because we are planting into the standing rye for a good reason now. Yes, depending on where you're located, you may have the option to roll prior to planting, excuse me. The reason we're planting into the standing crop is, one, to manage some of the residue there. So we didn't have to be concerned about slicing through that. For some operators, it's a concern, some it's not, depending on your equipment. But the other reason is that we are not really at the stage of maturity on the rye here that we'd like to see. We would love to see a little bit more time for enthesis, so that when we roll it or we want to terminate it mechanically, we can do that without having a lot of volunteer back. And so we're planting actually prior to rolling in this case. And we found that we can roll that crop much later than we anticipated in the past. So I'll just get into my next one. Here's another view from that planting process. I don't have a date on this, but I believe this is 2019 crop. And so it was wet as well. The clouds kind of indicate a little bit of the season.
Doug, do you remember in 2019, I mean, did you have neighbors that were also planting on this date? Or were people still having to wait to get in the field? And were you able to maybe get in the field kind of when you needed, because you had this kind of mat?
Mm-hmm. Yep, we did. So the thing that you'll hear from a lot of producers that get into cover crops is that it really carries the equipment so much better. So we did, I mean, if it wasn't raining out, we were able to run, you know, in this scenario, and we didn't leave a track in the field, where you're talking other farmers who are going to have more issues. We also didn't have to drive around low spots. You know, we planted from one fence row to the other. And so, you know, just the impact that that's going to have on your operation as far as getting things done and then doing it with a great peace of mind, because you know, you weren't leaving those ruts behind, or those ruts behind that you were going to have to deal with. And if you're looking at cultivating into those later, you know, if you're looking at row crop cultivating after that plant is established, because keep in mind, we're not doing any cultivation for weeds after this scenario at all. And which brings to mind an important point I want to make, and I talked about this with you earlier, May, is that, you know, do we have some weed growth in these scenarios afterwards? Absolutely, we do have some. You know, if your star on the wall is a perfectly clean field, then this will be a challenge for you. But what I will say is that in a situation, especially in a farm where you've got issues with, or challenges with, gigantic ragweed, in this scenario, yes, we do have some gigantic ragweed that'll come through in places, but the difference I want to point out is that those plants, when they come, they do not thrive, those ragweed plants, and they do not overpower the soybean crop in its entirety in the same areas, especially some of the low areas where they would normally. And so, yes, we'll have some weeds plantings or weeds coming through this canopy, but we are able to get a much higher yield in our soybeans in areas where they would be completely wiped out otherwise. So the ragweed, for example, just because that's what we're kind of talking about right now. Yeah, some will come through, but they will be very unhealthy looking plants in comparison to a tilled field in which you're trying to use mechanical cultivation to maintain those. So if you're wondering what it looks like when you're planting in a situation like that, we're going to try to give you a look. It's kind of like driving your tractor across the sea. You will see some dust coming up, and so some of those plants are getting to that anthesis stage, but not near as what we're targeting. And a lot of that, what's flat in the back, will come up because of that. Let's see if we can get past this one. So like May said, where is the roller crimper? So here is our rolling crimping after planting. This is a farmer-made roller crimper. It's got a pretty aggressive cleat on it. And if you'll notice, I talked about the wet conditions. If you noticed on the edges of the roller, and I could certainly play this again, we did have some mud built up on the corners, and that was as a result somewhat of the wet conditions, but also just by attempting to turn with the roller. If we found out that if we just took straight passes with the roller, we had less of that in this scenario. But you can see there aren't any spots in which we had to go around in this field, and it's not a flat field, right? So we've got some terrain in this situation. And if you remember back in the conditions that we had during 2019, that's significant. So that's really a great way to look at approaching things. There's a number of different ways of reducing tillage, but I wanted to add that if you haven't heard of John Sticka's book, A Soil Owner's Manual, he does a really good job of talking about the effects of tillage on a cropping situation and soil health. You know, it's important to realize that there is no tillage pass that ever directly benefits the soil. And if you consider that, I mean, as a standard, as a kind of a tenet, then it really puts us into questioning all of our tillage that we try to justify. And again, this is that context that I talked about before. You know, what things could be managed, and what things are we willing to look at alternatives for? Farmers are just great engineers and, you know, out of the box thinkers. If you need something to come up with or invent it or whatever, you know, just ask a farmer. So I encourage people not to try to not to create their own bottlenecks, right? this is something, new, relatively new within the last decade. And for example, I said that with our, location, we're looking at maturity dates on some of these things as crucial. And so we're actually rolling 2 weeks or greater after we plant the soybeans, and the soybeans are up, and we're still able to come in and terminate that rye at the appropriate time. Might we have a little bit of rye coming through? Yeah, we might have some rye coming through, but that's not an issue with the combine to deal with that. The combine actually never threw a track in these fields either, where the neighbors had struggled for weeks on end in this area to get crop out. So the direct benefits are just directly correlated with that in those scenarios. Drier conditions, well, yes, but if we're shading that ground, we're providing that armor that we talk about in soil health, and that's going to go a long ways into promoting the moisture that we do have in a plant growth and not into transpiration. So I also encourage people, if they're looking at doing this, to look at a specific variety of rye. If you have a VNS, you may have altering maturity times on that rye, and you may have more come through than if you had a specific variety of rye that's going to have a narrower pollination window. So here's a look at that soybean crop as it's coming through that thatch layer. I will say that a lot of producers that I've talked with do increase their planting populations on their soybeans. I couldn't tell you the exact one in this one, 200, 250,000, maybe even higher in some cases, depending on the seed and the desired results. But consider that when you're looking at having some of these scenarios, especially I think in a lot of cases here, this particular farm, they've looked at concentrating far less on closing that trench behind, especially in wet conditions where they didn't want to offer any, extra compaction. And that soybean plant made it through just fine with adequate moisture.
Doug, did you mention your seeding rate for the rye?
No, that's been kind of all over with different farms. I will say that the thicker the mat, typically the better the weed suppression, if that's your goal. 100 pounds has been oftentimes used. Bushel and a half is pretty typical. Preceding, and it depends on a little bit also on planting date. So a few things to consider there, but I guess I would say, look at that bushel and a half, maybe 2 bushel range. Some might be finding other things there too, different from what I stated, but that's kind of what we've looked at so far. Just looking at another way to reduce our tillage, if we feel that we do need to offer some tillage impact, would be strip till. This is a cover crop that's growing. We've got hairy vetch and a few other things growing in between here. This is intended to be corn. I like to look at strip till as a stepping stone, at least in conventional ag, to no-till. I don't like to look at it as a destination. And oftentimes it's kind of realized that as farms have progressed. But if you're concerned about a hard pan underneath and you feel that you simply need to do this in order to get what you need to for your results, this is a viable option. There are a number of different companies out there, that offer them. I do like straight shank compared to parabolic. We do move less dirt, and a number of options with baskets, rolly baskets and such. With the GPS equipment today, we know we have the ability to plant right on that precisely, so we don't have to be too concerned about following some of those ridges. And some could actually cultivate within that if that's your goal. In this case, a row mower was used later to suppress the cover crops in between those rows. You'll notice that these, you maybe can't tell, but this is actually 60-inch corn. These are 60-inch passes with the strip till to maintain some sunlight coming down to maintain a cover crop, but yet with this is going to be an open pollinated corn variety on a portion of this field, and there's tremendous ear flex with a lot of the corn varieties out there that are open pollinated, especially in wider row scenarios. And this is on an organic farm. So considering my background, if you're thinking back to what I offered before, you know, we have converted our farm to all perennials. And so when I looked at our operation and I wanted to satisfy every principle to the best of my ability within my context, I have gone to an all perennial system. And so with that, this is a view of my reduced disturbance on our farm with the sole purpose of restoring the resource the best I can. And I've proven a way on my own operation to be able to do that very financially viable. We not only graze our own, but we do custom grazing. And so with a perennial system, we're not doing any tillage at all, except for whatever tillage those animals are doing, which to me is mimicking or modeling after a natural system more. And so we have increased diversity with our grazing management from year to year. Now, that's not to say that any operation has to do what I'm doing, and I'm not saying that that's what I'm advocating here, but I would like producers, if they haven't considered it, to maybe even consider it in part. Because if you could put in a rotation of perennials into your system for a given amount of time, that's going to take a lot of tillage out of that operation, and the soil will benefit, when managed properly. And so haymaking is a way you can do that too, but I'd like you to consider how much carbon you're extracting from that operation if you're selling that hay off the farm. I would even say custom bale grazing should be a consideration for some operators. And you don't even have to own the livestock to do that. A large portion of our farm is now custom grazing. So we bring off farm animals in, and I like to joke that when summer camp's over, they have to go back home. And so as far as limiting risk, it can be tremendous. There are lots of different benefits. And the first step there would be to establish a good relationship with a cattle owner to be able to look at options to do that. I happen to throw in a second slide just for if you didn't like the colors, but if you like Holsteins, there's a picture of one of our custom groups there too. So we don't have to be specific with breed necessarily either. As we develop the resource and improve upon it, we can really get some nice gains on Holsteins as well as colored animals on these pastures.
That's a really good point, Doug, because I think a lot of people sort of look into this type of enterprise being that those animal, like if they're going to buy those animals, they're so affordable. So what kind of performance were you seeing like in this scenario as far as average daily gains?
It's improving over time as our pastures are improving with their management, I would say, but we're not getting anything less than a pound a day, especially on some of the Holstein Jersey breeds. There's actually a fair amount of Jersey genetics in this Holstein group too, even though you can't see it all in this picture. And there is a difference between, there's some minor differences between the breeds of cattle that we graze, because we do graze some Fleckvey crosses as well. And they can perform with, I would say, a lower base than some of the other breeds, but nonetheless, 2 pounds, it's not unreasonable to expect out of dairy replacement heifers at times. And so that's all going to depend on your resource and your management for sure. So having clear expectations with your cooperator is important.
For sure. I'll try not to turn this into a pasture and grazing webinar. I know we can do that pretty easily.
Yeah, well, it's really rewarding to be able to manage for improvements and see the products of your management. And I don't want to say that's reduced down to a pasture model for sure. I will add that we had good yields. I would say we had reasonable yields in our organic crop production when we were still doing corn and beans and small grains and flax and some edibles and that type of thing. One of the issues that I found is that I didn't have the consistency that I would have liked to have seen. We could have a really nice yield one year, but then the next year, things weren't quite the way we wanted to see, or we just didn't have the, there was more risk involved than I wanted to see. And by working with nature in the form that we are now, we have really come to find the answers to a lot of those questions, because, we're promoting life, and that life is what's going to promote our future production. And so even if you can do that, in a, we've got the cropland grazing exchange, for example, in Minnesota, and there's other offerings now, online services where you can try to match up with a livestock producer. Or if you have even cover crops, if you could incorporate small grains for 1 year out of 5 or something like that, and have a diverse cover to graze after the small grains are taking off. Try to find a producer that will come in, bring livestock in, build fence if they need to build fence. If you can provide water or electricity for a fence energizer, that's a great way to bring in what you cannot bring in a jug, you can bring in with animals. And that impact could be the next step game changer in your operation if you're looking to do something next. So with that, here's just a little information from me as far as Sustainable Farming Association, my contact information. I do go out to farms. We have conversations with farmers all the time on how they can incorporate different management practices, think outside the box. Sometimes it's just having the conversation and verbalizing some of their thoughts to sort through some things. So we work with row crop operations, we work with livestock operations, dairy operations and such. So we can kind of address it all. So if this is something that you have been thinking about or whatever, simply check us out for sure online at sfa-minnesota.org. And we're also on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and such. So check us out. Give me a call directly if you'd like. I'd encourage you to do so. And that's what I have.
Doug, can you see that chat box, or maybe bring it up if you haven't already? We have a good little conversation going on there, and maybe I'll let you kind of check in with that while I share my screen and contribute a little bit for my portion here. Good stuff talking about pasture in rotation. All right, so I will share my screen here.
Sure. Did you want me to address some of the questions as you're going there, May, or you want me to hold off?
Let's go ahead and address them. Yeah.
Okay. Those of you who added crops / lengthen your rotation to try and reduce tillage, what did you add? I did, say small grains, really, especially small grains. I love small grains because oftentimes, they're all, for the most part, pretty mycorrhizal friendly. And so when we're looking at our limiting factor biologically on our systems, we want to get to a 1-to-1 fungal bacterial ratio. And small grains add so many opportunities because of their length of maturity and their ability to take understory crops as well. So you can incorporate some legumes underneath, some especially subterranean legumes underneath a small grain situation, and take that off, especially if you could straight cut it off the top and leave that residue behind, or even one of these stripper heads can be really, really good. And then you have a grazing opportunity too. And if you don't have livestock around, at least having that diversity in that system could set you up even for some no-till applications in organic production the next year. Something you certainly have to work with on your own operation, but that's one way I would say I would look at doing that along with rye, because I said you can plant it so late yet. As long as you can, I've seen guys planting rye in the snow, and still have a viable crop. So that's where I would start.
Awesome.
Are you all right?
Thanks, Doug. Well, my inspector brain, I'm going to go back to kind of why are we having this conversation in terms of organic as a certification. And I wanted to share a little bit. I'm sure some of you have heard, let me go ahead and make this bigger. I'm sure some of you have heard about the regenerative organic standard that's being developed. I know we got Kevin Fulton on the call here. I'm sure he's been up and up on that too. So I just wanted to share, this is still in development, but, part of the standard is to reduce or eliminate tillage if you are certified organic and want to be regenerative organic certified. And here they talk about, you know, if you are still using tillage, use what they call this tillage action plan. And I kind of did some digging and found out, you know, what that is, what it means. And, you know, here it's basically saying, you know, you have to demonstrate, you know, why you're using tillage and propose, you know, how you could omit some of your tillage. As an inspector, you know, I start thinking about the struggle of potentially needing to do enforcement or some kind of action to make sure people are following this plan. And that's a very complicated discussion as well. And so as I'm having conversations with folks at Rodale and some of the people at the table, creating the standard, you know, those are the kinds of things that I'm going to be curious about as this gets implemented. That's for a whole other webinar, this regenerative organic standard. So again, having to potentially demonstrate kind of your game plan. You know, just from my perspective, you have to remember, you know, I have more of a bird's eye perspective on these systems and what I've just seen in the field that's working and not working for folks. A lot of the research too that I've read really proposes more of a kind of rotational, rational approach to reducing tillage in these systems. And I really feel like, you know, we've covered this whole idea of using basically plants as a mechanism to reduce tillage, whether that's for weed control or soil cover. There's, of course, you know, we've talked about beans being no-tilled into rye. Aaron Silva in Wisconsin and numerous other researchers in kind of the Corn Belt region of the Midwest have done some studies on these systems and the efficacy and the details surrounding them, but there's still some kind of buyer beware elements to the system. And I will say I have not heard of any academic institution studying this system where they plant beans into living rye. It's always the focus has been on, you know, terminating that rye prior to. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that part of the conversation. And just for devil's advocate, you know, the more I read and talk to folks, there are studies out there that show that in an organic system, you know, more soil carbon can be retained in that system, even if there is tillage going on, than some no-till systems in some environments. So I don't think there's a need to say, well, no-till is always the solution. You know, I think like we've emphasized already, and Doug has talked about this idea of context. I think just keeping that in mind when we're having these discussions is so important, and not to think, you know, one is, you know, the only solution everywhere. Doug, did I devil's advocate you enough?
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem. I'm just reading through some of the chats here too and catching up on some people's perspectives, and I appreciate it.
And of course, you know, I work for a company that's based in South Dakota. I work with growers in South Dakota, and, you know, we're of course trying to facilitate the development of organic more in that state specifically. And, you know, when you look at the development of no-till farming, South Dakota's been the leader in a lot of ways. But there are studies and some examples out there, you know, showing some of the synthetic chemical use in these systems can be damaging. So I'm just kind of encouraging a balanced approach to this conversation, that there's not just one solution. A lot of my experience in the field and organic systems have been with dairy producers using alfalfa in rotation, of course, because they need that feed. But I would say there's not as much heavy deep tillage going on in organic systems as some folks might think. Of course, with alfalfa, it still is kind of the preferred choice. And, you know, Doug, we talked about that earlier. Is there a better option when you need alfalfa in your rotation and you want an annual following that crop?
I think that's a great point to bring up because, first of all, I question if we ever need really all alfalfa for a perennial system. And typically, like you said, in a dairy scenario, why we're trying to grow that legume like that predominantly is to make up for the shortfalls protein-wise in our corn silage-based rations. You know, again, looking at nature. So do we ever have a monocrop in nature? Not so much. So we can actually make our fields just as hard with a straight legume crop over time as we could if we did continuous applications of anhydrous ammonia. So yes, it's a perennial. Yes, we're not doing tillage so much, but what are we doing, you know, big picture wise when we're doing some of those scenarios, or if we're only looking at supplementing nitrogen through a cover crop scenario? You know, we really need that diversity in order to be able to tap into some of those symbiotic relationships that we're trying to foster or should be looking to promote in our systems, because that's when we can start looking at logarithmic improvements and not just linear improvements. So for sure, you know, looking at different perennial systems, but, you know, again, think outside the box and always think of diversity. When we're looking at a well-balanced natural system, we're actually looking at a very small percentage of legume in that scenario, because legume is not the only way, for example, that we're producing nitrogen. You know, protozoa is a bacteria that we're looking at that's converting. You know, it's a bacteria, that's its job, right? And it doesn't require legume to do it. So, yep, just looking big picture, but also, you know, some of these things could be really new to some people listening and maybe not, but getting back to the whole journey thing, you know, being able to look at this saying that, hey, I'll never really figure it all out, but I'm really going to enjoy learning what I can as I go and applying it to my farm. Everybody has to start someplace. So I think it's great.
Definitely. I mean, you'll see me talk about oats a lot in real life and on these webinars. I'm a huge fan of oats. One organic grower I worked with had been using oats as a green manure prior to corn every time he raised a crop of corn. Of course, it was a former dairy farm, so he had some latent benefits from some of his fields having had consistent and somewhat heavy manure application over the years. But, you know, the reason I bring up oats is that there is some really, really intriguing science out there on oats as a way to facilitate the development of mycorrhizal fungi. And, you know, Doug and I have talked a lot about, you know, part of the journey of promoting soil health is balancing that fungal and bacterial ratio in soils. And, you know, I think there's a lot of old wisdom out there with the use of oats as a nurse crop, you know, oats mellowing the soil. And now there's real data behind why that is. It's because those oats, at least in this particular study in South Dakota, really had this relationship with hosting and helping this mycorrhizal fungi develop. We've also talked a lot about high-speed discs. I've heard from several growers that are using things like a Lemkin disc, having really good luck with it. And I think there's still a lot of questions surrounding, is high-speed tillage less disturbing or damaging to the soil profile? And Doug, I know we had some thoughts on that earlier. Do you want to share kind of what we were talking about there?
There is some interest. There's some conversations that are going on about the fact that we are using the speed that we are and how much we can move material, specifically soil, with some of these high speed units. So, you know, think about the guy being launched out of the out of the cannon too. You know, it's not the launching that's the problem at the circus. It's the arrival, right? It's the impact of when he ends up being there. So sometimes we can think that we're not going as deep and that type of thing, but we really have to look at big picture. And I'd be interested to see if there's going to be some more research done, because I think of it from a biological community perspective. And I guess I don't want to get, too extreme, but I think about, if you want to divide up a community, even in genocide, the first thing they did is separate people. And so if you're going to start separating individuals from a biological community with a physical movement like this, that's going to facilitate a breakdown of the system. You're not going to have quorum numbers anymore to be able to facilitate some of the processes that we're relying on. So I'm not trying to throw them all out. I'm just saying that necessarily the first things, or the silver bullet concept that this is really the thing to do, might not be, especially if we consider the fact that no tillage event ever directly benefits the soil.
Well, and I bring up flame weeding here as well, because it was interesting that we had a weed control themed webinar. I think it was 2 weeks ago, and the gentleman presenting there, James from kind of East Central Nebraska, was flame weeding the soybean, like on the soybean, to the point where it was wilted, and in 5 days it would come back. And so it was really interesting that today Doug throws out, let's plant soybeans into living rye and kind of roll over them, and up they come. So it's interesting how many organic growers really are pushing the mark, because there is no academic research that I've seen that's looked at, the resiliency of soybeans to that kind of disturbance. So just interesting points. We've talked about livestock use. We're kind of running low on time here, but I just wanted to, I love this back of the napkin math. I used to be in the feedlot compliance world, so I spent a lot of time on manure management conversations in the field. And this is just, these numbers are just based on university, extension standard data. So here, as far as, when you're exploring that potential advantage for livestock in the field, 40 cows in 1 month producing at least 350 pounds of nitrogen, that's a pretty exciting number to me, especially if you're an organic grower in need of affordable fertility. And we've talked about tillage as just another type of disturbance. And I just wanted to mention, in my background, I worked on a ranch in the Sandhills in Nebraska for 2 years, and we were doing kind of mob grazing before it was really a popularized term. And we were doing it with both Scottish Highland cattle, which are in these pictures here. They're just moving from paddock to paddock. And we also would do this with custom grazed yearlings as well. So, I mentioned that deep massage, that's the term that some of the stockmen, we would collaborate with when we were exploring this idea of mob grazing. That's the term we would use with the kind of action that would happen in these pastures with that level of density and then rest.
I love that deep massage comment, because I think a lot of times people think that, well, moldboard plowing could be the same as the effect of cattle. And it may look like that to us, but the response of those soil systems tells us some things very different. You can really beat up a piece of ground with some livestock as long as it's an acute disturbance and not a chronic one.
Right.
And, it's just not the same as taking the moldboard plow through.
These pastures would not see another animal for a year, typically. At least that was the system at the time that I was there. So pros and cons to all that. Again, a whole other topic in and of itself.
It is, but it is also important to point out that when we're talking about grazing, we're not talking about set stock grazing. We're talking about managed grazing, and there's a huge difference. So I just need to point that out.
Doug, do we have any other questions that came up on the chat since I've started, or is it kind of just time to wrap up?
Well, there's some conversation going on, and I don't know if I can keep with it all. So certainly reach out to either one of us if you'd like to continue the conversation for sure. I did notice, John had made a comment about not knowing, how long to keep something in a pasture rotation. There are a few ways you could approach that, but certainly identify your resource concern first, and then maybe even look at some PLFA testing or something like that to see what kind of progress you've made during your pasture rotation. And also I just want to reiterate a comment made that irregardless of where you start, there are no stupid questions. And so don't be afraid to hold the conversation if you're new to this.
Just think about how many stupid questions come up along the way when you're trying to mob graze Scottish Highland cattle in the prairie. There's just endless. Well, I will start wrapping up here since we're approaching on noon. Just wanted to mention that this, transition toolkit program is something I kind of facilitate with Dakota's Best. We work with growers who are considering transition or already in the process to help with anything and everything from record keeping systems to some of those certification questions, rotation planning, things like that. So reach out to me. Here's my contact information. Reach out to me anytime with questions about what we do, what's going on in the organic world. I wanted to share too, I talked about small grains today, and next week that's going to be the focus of the conversation with our next Friday on the Farm. It will be at the same link that you had today. And then I definitely wanted to share that we are hosting a summit in Platte, South Dakota. It will actually be at the community center, which is a hop, skip, and a jump away from our warehouse at Dakota's Best Seed. We have just an awesome lineup of grower panels, different folks from the organic industry. We're going to talk a lot about marketing, some of the updates on the regulatory side as well. So please check out organicfarmteam.com. You can find our full agenda there and purchase tickets. So with that, I think we'll wrap up today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I've really enjoyed these webinars, and I think we had a good conversation today. Have a nice day, everyone.